In this episode, I interviewed Josh Hart of StopSmartMeters.org. So StopSmartMeters.org is basically a one-stop for everything you could ever need or want to know about smart meters. So that's what Josh has been focused on for quite a while now, creating awareness for the problems associated with smart meters. So just a bit of background on the guest. Josh Hart is director of Stop Smart Meters. He's worked in the energy industry as a transportation planner, environmental advocate, and freelance journalist. He obtained his Master of Science in Transport Planning in the UK in 2008 and completed research titled Driven to Excess, Presenting the Social and Quality of Life Impacts of Automobile Traffic on Local Residents. The research was covered in over 100 international media outlets, including the BBC, The Guardian, Tehran Times, and the Daily Mail. So, with the topic of EMF, there's lots of issues associated. There's lots of good organizations out there creating awareness, but what Josh is specifically focused on is the smart meters. Now, the topics, or some of the topics we cover in the podcast, were how Josh became involved in this whole EMF, wireless radiation, and the health effects area, what StopSmartMeters.org hopes to achieve, what sort of information is available on the website, how to use the website, how does the negative health effects actually arise from smart meters? Which types of EMF are emitted by it? Because it's not just one; it's mainly radio frequency radiation, but there's others. Why can't people choose the old types of smart meters? What you need to do if you want to try and switch back to the old electromechanical types, which were not quote-unquote smart and didn't have these health problems associated with them. What is the social license for these companies and what they're doing? Why radio frequency radiation is bad? How come some parts of the world are not getting this and most are? How to lobby your local council or government to try and get them to understand your concerns, shielding options if you can't get it removed, and also EMF meter options, because I think it's really important that more and more people get EMF meters, especially when so many people want a quick fix. They want a pendant, they want a crystal, a shungite, whatever, to put in their pocket, and then they don't have to worry about this problem. But getting an EMF meter actually allows you to start informing yourself, your environment, your sleep environment, your work environment, whatever, and then you know what the issues are and you can start to remediate them. So with that, I will start the episode. Hello, Josh. So I was thinking we could start off with how you became involved, interested, and learnt about this whole EMF wireless radiation topic.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on your show. And I always had a cell phone up until about 2010. For a long time, about a decade, I used it. Didn't think anything really of it. Maybe wondered a little bit about why my ear was getting warm when I used it for long periods. But generally did not consider claims about wireless radiation being harmful to health as being legitimate. And that changed when Pacific Gas and Electric attempted to deploy smart meters, wireless digital smart electric meters onto everyone's home without asking permission, starting in 2009 in California. And I learned more about the issue and realized that something had to be done. And we organized, along with a lot of other people at that time, a direct action and awareness campaign, and pressured the utility and the state government to offer an opt-out, and we were pressuring them to put an end to them. But they came out with a quote-unquote opt-out policy.
So that people could keep their, what's it called? We'll go into this
Analog
a little
meters,
bit as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes people call them electromechanical. Is that the same
Yeah,
term?
electromechanical is a descriptive term. It's technically an electromechanical analog meter, and just means no electronic components. It's just mechanical and electric.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So when that happened, you started diving into the research online.
Yeah, I looked. I was pretty shocked to discover that there is, and there was a decade ago, and now it's an even greater body of evidence indicating real harm from levels of radiation that are associated with common consumer items like cell phones and iPads, and then the smart meters were just another level on that, another addition to the radiation that people are being exposed to. But it's different because you can't choose whether or not, in many cases, to have these in your community. They're just put in. In many cases, the utility lies and tells you that you have no right to refuse. And so, whereas a cell phone is an optional decision that you make and decide which carrier to do or whether to have one at all. A lot of times utilities came in and just said you have no choice. We're putting this on your wall, even if it's right by your kid's bedroom, and and never mind the consequences, which we've seen are been pretty horrific.
Yeah, and so for listeners, I always try and give them a quick recap of EMF when we go into these topics. So basically, there's three main types, and there's electric fields, magnetic fields, radio frequency radiation, and then a fourth one, dirty electricity. And so with the smart meters, which of those are we mainly concerned with?
So smart meters contribute to all four of those that you mentioned. Unfortunately, they put dirty electricity, which is basically essentially electrical noise, onto the wiring. They emit radio frequency microwave radiation pulses through the air. And they also, by virtue of being an electric device, emit electric and magnetic fields into the environment. So people should be definitely aware of the EMF hazard. Any kind of electric device, including an analog electromechanical meter, is going to be emitting some type of EMF, in this case, low frequency magnetic and electric fields. But those are generally within only about 6 to 10 feet of the meter. And so not like microwave RF that would permeate a house, for example, and certainly be very strong in a bedroom, for example, near the meter. So people need to be aware that any kind of electricity does have documented health impacts, and there is a trade-off between convenience and appliances and the electromagnetic fields that are created by everyday electricity usage. And now the smart meters and the smart grid has taken that and exacerbated the problems with the existing problems with the electrical grid.
Yeah, with those four types, and you said it contributes to all of them. I generally try and, because it's quite overwhelming for people. I mean, like you mentioned, electric and magnetic fields, generally those two are less of an issue than radio frequency radiation and dirty electricity, right?
It really depends
because they, like you say, the distance.
It really depends on the circumstance. For example, if you live right next to a very large power line, for example, that's not necessarily going to be putting out any radio frequency, although it might, because there might be a cell tower nearby or mounted on it that the wires can carry and re-emit. But that typically a large power line would only be emitting mostly in the magnetic and electric field areas, and so if you live right next door to that, that's not going to be healthy for you at all. And so it's a matter of how long you're exposed and how close you are to the device or the infrastructure that's emitting these electromagnetic fields. But just to say, electromagnetic fields in general, like from the sun, like light, the magnetic field that the Earth produces, those are all natural. We've been evolving with them since we were tiny little organisms, and we depend on them for our health. These new sort of artificial EMFs are caused by wireless and electrical devices, and our bodies aren't used to that. They're not accustomed to it, and as a result, of this exposure, we're seeing many, many, many health problems being reported to us, and in general, that a lot of people, go to the doctor and they say, I'm having headaches or I can't sleep, and they're prescribed pharmaceuticals, which covers up the symptoms, but it's not getting to the issue, which is that we've created like a toxic cocktail of electromagnetic fields in today's modern world.
Yeah, yeah, and like you mentioned with we've got artificial EMFs and natural EMFs, and so I think it's really funny. You sometimes see people trying to kind of troll on the internet, and they'll say, "Oh, the sun gives off more electromagnetic energy than your Wi-Fi router. So if you're scared of the Wi-Fi router, why aren't you scared of the sun?" It's like, because we evolved with the sun. It's totally natural.
And
I think that's a common misconception.
Keep in mind that the sun in overdose can kill you. If you're not adapted and you don't have the skin type, it can really burn you, cause cancer, and a lot of other problems. And it's all in moderation. But of course, when people are under the assumption that the government or corporations are acting in their best interests and responding to the science, that's an assumption that's unfortunately not correct. And as a result, people use devices, including cell phones, giving cell phones to their kids, that we know are hazardous because of the peer-reviewed science associated with those kind of exposures.
Yeah. And touching on just the science, you do have a background in science, qualified. Did you ever touch on the EMF in your university learnings?
Not directly. I do have a master's in science in transportation planning from the University of the West of England in Bristol, UK, and did a dissertation called "Driven to Excess" about the social impacts of motor vehicle traffic on 3 different streets in Bristol, and we showed significant deterioration in the social connections on the streets with heavy traffic, and we found strong communities measured by the numbers of acquaintances and social connections and friendships between neighbors. Put simply, if there was heavy traffic, people didn't want to cross the street to see their neighbors, and they didn't want to hang out on the street for long periods of time. And we're seeing, in some cases where small cells or the smart grid or large cell towers are going in, it's killing the street community. So people no longer have, what are so important, those really, spontaneous contacts with their neighbors that can lead to, community action, for example, to resist these technologies.
Yeah, and we were talking about it before we started, but you also mentioned how that relates to smart meters because, in this car study you did, people would move away from the rooms closest to the street, obviously because of the noise pollution, maybe the exhaust fumes as well. And with smart meters, it's sort of the same. People, once they're aware of it, they have to move to the other end of the house, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, people are abandoning their homes or parts of their homes, using rooms as storage, or just closing them off entirely. Rooms that are right next to the smart meter. So this is a significant taking by the utility of private property, and it's really a violation of people's right to health and safety in their home. But we saw that similar patterns where people retreat from the street, retreat from the negative environmental impact, whether it be noise or pollution or traffic danger, or in this case, we're talking about radio frequency microwave pollution. In many cases, people are caught in situations where they are microwaved and know that they're being microwaved and feel the symptoms, and because of existing social norms and corporate propaganda that build up this idea that we can't say no, people are having to live in these situations, and it's very sad. But increasingly, we're seeing people resisting, communities getting together, organizing, and in some cases, taking direct action or legal action to defend the safety of their communities.
Yeah, and there's quite a few things to go into from there. But I guess because we're early on in the show, I think we should go over the basics of the effect. So, as we mentioned before, it contributes to all 4 of the electromagnetic field types, but the worst one, if you had to say, would be the radio frequency radiation, right? So the waves that the smart meters emitting in all directions, including through the wall and into your home.
That is the type of EMF. You're correct. Radio frequency that is of greatest sort of recent concern, just by virtue of its sudden expansion. And we've had the electric grid, for quite a while, and people have had so all types of EMFs are harmful, artificial EMFs that the body hasn't evolved to deal with. But of particular concern to scientists and doctors these days is the rapid proliferation of radio frequency microwave emitting technology. This is anything that intentionally communicates. So cell phones, Wi-Fi, smart meters, cordless phones. These are all, cell towers. These are all sources of radio frequency, and these have been particularly increasing over the last decade or two, in particular. We've lived with, low frequency magnetic fields and electric fields from power lines and appliances for a number of decades now, maybe 8 decades for a lot of the West. And so we've seen those increases in the so-called diseases of civilization just by virtue of exposure to electricity from low frequency electromagnetic fields. In fact, Sam Millam did a study in the 1930s where he looked at electrification of rural households, and he found that diseases of civilization and Alzheimer's and cancer increased. So what we're concerned about, these days, in particular, radio frequency. This is, we don't have decades and decades of exposure to it. And typically cancers that are caused by radiation do take decades to develop. And so we could be creating this, increase in cancer that is sort of, like climate change, sort of set in motion, decades before we actually see the real, effects come to light. So it's a real risk that we're taking with our kids. It's a risk that we're taking with our DNA. And, people need to take this very seriously and not be complacent in trusting that the government or corporations are setting adequate standards, because particularly in the Western English-speaking countries, they're really not in this case.
Yeah, I've heard that basically the kind of Anglo countries like the UK, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand have the worst standards, or some of the worst, and then other parts of mainland Europe have, still bad standards, and the better standards are in like Luxembourg, Switzerland.
Yeah, Russia has lower standard, although not, no country that we're aware of, has standards or guidelines that are consistent fully with the peer-reviewed science showing harm. So there are, lower standards, 100 to 1 difference between the U.S. standard, which is the highest in the world, and allows these telecom companies to literally get away with murder. But it's important to note that in Austria, Russia. There's places that are places like that where the levels are significantly lower, and that has been put in place over the years as more science has come to light. But unfortunately, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the U.S., being really run by the corporations it's meant to regulate, it has completely failed to do any sort of health or safety based guidelines and to enforce those.
Yeah, and just for the beginners who might have no idea what we're even talking about. So the smart meter, the old-fashioned ones, the electromechanical analog smart meters, someone from the utility company would come out once a month and check them and then get the data. But nowadays, the modern ones, they are sending the information wirelessly, sort of at different times during the day, to let the company know, they're using this amount of electricity now and they're using this amount now. Is that a good
Correct.
summary of
Yeah.
it?
So, for decades, electric companies have been using electromechanical analog technology, which is basically a spinning disc that responds to how much electricity is flowing down the wire. And a meter reader will come and read it at the end of the month and bill you accordingly. Essentially, the meter has been simply a cash register that puts out a number that measures the number of kilowatt hours, and then they come and read it and send you a bill. And the utilities have operated under legal easements. So these are legal documents that tell you what rights a corporation or a municipal utility, what rights those entities have to operate on private property. And those have been very limited to going on your property, reading your meter, maintaining your analog meter, and ensuring that you're being billed properly and not getting away with stealing electricity or anything. And so that's what the easement says. The easement does not say, and you can look this up, if people own their home or if they rent, you can look this up with the county or city or local government, sometimes a realtor or title company. But these easements do not allow specifically utilities to install surveillance devices or irradiating devices. Just the way they're not allowed to put a smart meter on your home without your permission. It's the same as if they wanted to put a cell tower on your roof. They would require your permission. So a lot of people don't know this. The opt-out policies that, or not, as the case may be, the option that utilities give people to keep their analog or to choose to have one, are often misleading in that we never opted into their smart meter plans. We were never consulted. We don't give permission, and in that sense, we're not opting out. We're just refusing to opt in, and many people are refusing to pay so-called opt-out fees, which are essentially charge people to protect their safety, and particularly people who are sick with EMF illness. It's unconstitutional. It violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. And
there we go.
So people who are sick with EMF illness, who are electro-hypersensitive or electromagnetically sensitive, as is the term, the more common term nowadays, those people are really being discriminated against by the utility. They're, violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, violations of constitutional protections. And essentially, the utility is requiring payments for protection, which is essentially a protection racket or extortion. And so we urge people to boycott the fees, to refuse to pay them. We have never paid opt-out fees in the last 10 years since smart meters have been deployed in our area. And we fought through and we've resisted. It's not always been easy. We were disconnected, my wife and I, for 16 months for refusing to pay an opt-out fee when we moved up to the Sierra Nevada mountain community in California. We fought that in court and got the utility to back down and restore our analog meter and drop all the fees that they had charged us. So, I think it's really important for people to realize that communities and individuals have the right to refuse smart meters, and particularly people whose lives have been damaged by smart meters or by EMF.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a term that comes to mind is social license to operate. And I think there are a lot of companies that are aware of that, like the triple bottom line, so profit, environmental, and sustainability. But some of these companies that are, using or selling these or pushing these smart meters on people, they're kind of neglecting that component, because once a significant number of people are not happy with that sort of a service, they're going to it's going to cost them to undo and put all the electromechanical ones back in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not only is it a mistake for the health and safety of the public, but financially for these corporations and systems that we rely on, for our daily energy usage. It's really what the smart grid and smart meter deployment of the early 2010s has done, in our opinion, is really generate a huge amount of resentment against the utilities. That last year we had another pretty terrible fire year in California, and we've had a couple of seasons of utility caused wildfires as well as blackouts, and when a utility pulls the plug in order to try and prevent a wildfire, you have thousands of people who are maybe on medical devices or needing, electricity for cooling, who are old and vulnerable on the one hand, and then you have the risk of wildfire on the other. So, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric in California is the nation's biggest utility and probably the most corrupt. And so when you combine, these major power lines, deploying the smart grid against unwilling communities, operating in such a way as to, put all of these antennas that support the smart grid into rural areas. And for every electronic device you add to an electrical grid, you're creating, at least one more potential spark that can create a fire. So, PG&E has been raising their rates to pay for these things that people don't want, putting communities at risk through fire and radiation. And I think people are really ready for an alternative. I think the social license is really important, but to these utilities, all that matters is the license that they get to legally operate from the government. And where you have governmental processes and electoral corruption, that calls into question, whether community is actually giving consent in some cases. And in this case, we have nearly 60 local governments in California pass resolutions or even ordinances prohibiting smart meters from their jurisdictions. So this is something that local governments and the public were not informed about, were not consulted about, and are continuing to resist to this day.
Wow, that's quite impressive. So 60, you say, counties in California that have
cities and counties.
Yeah, that have passed legislation that you don't have to have one, or they're banning.
There are about 10, I believe, at last count, that passed ordinances prohibiting smart meters. Two, I believe, Sebastopol and Fairfax, who are actually enforcing those ordinances, and then the rest, the 58 or 60, I think it was somewhere around there. I believe it's 58 that we have documented on our website. But those, the rest of those passed resolutions or wrote letters in some way taking a stand against smart meter deployment. So this was not something that was bought into by local government, at least, or the representatives of the public.
That's still quite impressive to have that number of areas that are on board with this. And is it the same in other parts of the United States?
There was really a surge of resistance in California specifically that kind of spread out across the country, and there have been numerous pockets of resistance. Even in places like the Midwest, which has generally been pretty tough for people opposing smart meters. In Iowa, there was a lot of people involved in a proceeding, and they got some improvement in policies. But really, where we've seen the biggest effect is people taking direct action, people refusing to allow these things on their house, no matter what, no matter which authority figure tells them that they have to. For example, in 2012, PG&E was operating without an opt-out program and going into neighborhoods and just throwing these things on, throwing the smart meters on people's homes. We had children getting sick, kids reporting headaches and bloody noses in the rooms directly adjacent to the smart meters. And when the parents would call PG&E and said, "Hey, you just installed this meter, it's making my kid sick, you got to remove it," they would refuse and say, "Well, I'm sorry, there's no choice. You have to have one." And so this was an untenable situation. And so we and some other advocates in the area organized a electrician to remove these smart meters. The people in question gave notice to the utility that they were going to do that. And so these smart meters were carefully removed. Obviously, anytime you swap out a meter, it's super dangerous. There's a ton of current going through there, and you can die. So you need to know what you're doing. In this case, there was a a man who knew what he was doing, and he collected about 10 of these unwanted smart meters, which we boxed up and took to the local PG&E office, called the media, and had a public return of unwanted equipment. We just dropped it on their desk, and they got everyone to leave, called the police. So that was an example. PG&E kept trying to force smart meters on people. This was during the holiday season, and so the news was covering this. And so you had a situation where, about a week after we did the press conference, those families got disconnected. So about a week after we did the press conference in front of the PG&E office, PG&E disconnected the electricity of all those people who had taken part, including the family with the children with bloody noses. And this was about a week to 10 days before Christmas. And so the local news station was covering this, and they came out to one of these houses, and they had they showed the refrigerator and the freezer melting, the house darkened, the Christmas tree darkened, and kids that are upset. And this was, this made PG&E look really bad. It contributed to their overall negative public perception. And we depicted PG&E as the Grinch that stole Christmas, which indeed they were doing, literally, by suddenly cutting off these people. And the local news station picked up that theme and did a little clip of the Grinch along with their coverage of what PG&E was doing. And so this led to supervisors in the local county formally adopting an ordinance prohibiting smart meters. It contributed to legislation that was being prepared in the state legislature to force PG&E to provide an opt-out, and then eventually the analog opt-out that the California Public Utilities Commission approved under pressure from a lot of different angles. But again and again, we've seen where people only remain within the system, only write a letter or sign a petition or ask the utility or their government to do the right thing. It hasn't been so successful. But where communities take the initiative and say, this is our right to be safe in our homes, we are not going to risk our family's health for your profits, and no matter what you say, and take action to enforce that together, and their solidarity, then we've seen a lot of success. We've seen people retain their analog meters, and communities block harmful wireless projects. And so that's what we continue to do these days, is to advise groups and individuals all over the world who are organizing and fighting to stop these kinds of corporate technology deployments that are really inappropriate and harmful.
Yeah. And I think, people who are new to this, and I do get a lot of people who are new to the topic listening to my podcasts, I try to make it beginner friendly. The thing that causes the root cause of all these problems is the difference in standards, right? So there's, what you and I and other people are going off is the peer-reviewed, the science that that the Building Biology Institute, for example, they've got guidelines relating to EMF that are based on precautionary principle, focused on health and safety, and these other entities are using a different set of standards, and their set of standards are insanely high. So to them, if they're just looking at their bits of paper, they think, well, it's completely within the threshold of safety, so there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. But there's another set of standards. I think that's what so many people in the world don't understand, that there's differences in standards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, I mean, our perspective is that wireless communications should be used, if at all, for emergency purposes. And so it's not a matter of saying, oh, we can continue to use our cell phones and iPads and all this technology and Wi-Fi, and it'll all be great, and we just need to turn it down a bit. So I don't think that's really the case. I think that, looking at this from a health perspective, there are major fundamental, terminal problems with the wireless systems that we've developed. And from a climate perspective, there are seriously terminal problems for the wireless systems that we've created, because technology and particularly data centers and cell towers are the fastest growing source of carbon emissions in the world today. Um, they are taking up an increasing role of the percentage of emissions, and there's that statistic that an iPhone over its lifetime is going to basically be using the same amount of energy as a refrigerator over its lifetime, and so that's a huge amount of energy that is not a sustainable usage of energy. So when we talk about levels, and exposures, another thing to consider is that these exposures are not uniform across society. A lot of the time, cell towers will be placed in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. A lot of the time, whereas a homeowner on a large parcel can opt out of a smart meter and generally keep their exposures low, a lower income person in a block of flats might be living next to a bank of up to 80 or more electric smart meters pulsing microwave radiation all night long, and creating a heightened risk for those populations. So that's something to consider when we think about this politically. In some ways, the opt-out policies have taken the momentum out of the anti-smart meter movements by allowing certain classes of people to not have a smart meter on their homes. But what we say is that you don't have an opt-out if it's not an opt-out for all. And right now, if someone calls up and they say, I want to opt out, and they're living next to a bank of 80 smart meters on their bedroom wall, the utility will say, okay, that's $75 plus $10 a month, please, and you still have 79 smart meters on your wall. So there's a real difference in how the socio-economic consequences of these technologies, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
So the next thing I wanted to ask was, the companies say that you were mentioning how they want to prioritize their profit, but how does smart meters actually help the company out in the first place, other than the fact that they can manage who's using what amount of electricity when? Because people are still going to have the same length showers, the same amount of time cooking, whether it's a smart meter or an analog meter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the lie that the utilities have spread that smart meters or the smart grid are some solution to climate change is patently false, and in fact, the opposite is true. People are still going to be using the same amount of electricity with an analog meter or a smart meter, but with a smart meter, the actual meter, which is essentially a computer, consumes its own electricity, and that's not insignificant when you consider the millions of smart meters and the associated infrastructure that are going in. This is actually leading to a higher level of energy consumption, and we're ending up paying for that. So and that's not even considering the energy costs to manufacture all these meters and the need to remove them and dispose of them. There are some small savings in terms of meter reading, gasoline costs, and so forth. But from a safety perspective, you no longer have eyes on the system. You no longer have a meter reader not only checking to see how much electricity or gas you've consumed, but also whether there's a gas leak in your neighborhood might blow up. For example, in San Bruno, in California, there was a large explosion that killed several people. And this was just after the smart meters went in. And if a meter reader had been walking down the street, smelled gas, or inspected it, that might have been averted, that kind of disaster.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. You mentioned how they claim that it's more environmentally sustainable, or it's better for the environment that they have the smart meters because they can make these energy efficiency savings and things like that. But as you mentioned, that the smart meter itself has its own not insignificant energy consumption, And also, there's obviously the loss of productivity and efficiency in society when people are sick and unhealthy. Why is that's not being taken into account in the calculations of whether or not the pro cons of this technology?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who can no longer work, have been sensitized by these smart meters. A lot of the time people think, who are new to this issue, think, oh, you're either sensitive to these waves, this EMF, or you're not. And from our perspective and from our experience, we realized that the smart meters, because of their pulse nature, constitute an EMF injury to people. It's just like as if you were out in the sun too long, got a sunburn, and then tried to go in the sun again. Levels of exposure that would be fine before are now a problem. And so we see again and again when smart meters are deployed, and people are exposed in their homes. Sometimes they can no longer be around cell phones or Wi-Fi, and suffer pretty severe symptoms that as you say, and other wireless devices like that.
Cool. Yeah, and so another topic I wanted to discuss was, your website's got a lot of good information on it for people who are looking to make a difference in their community. But if people were wanting to get started, say, lobbying their local council or government and expressing their concern, how would they go about doing that? What's the best way to get started? What sort of facts do they need on their side to make a convincing argument?
Yeah, so stopsmartmeters.org provides a number of resources on our website and through our hotline that people can use. And I think the first thing that's important is to familiarize yourself with the science and the facts so that you can respond to questions or claims. And we have a page called The Science, which people can click on. It's on the menu at stopsmartmeters.org. And that links to a number of peer-reviewed studies which go into the reasons why and the evidence for the fact that existing guidelines for exposure are inadequate. So that's that issue. And we urge people, to not neglect the other related issues that are raised by these kinds of technologies, like the loss of privacy, for example. That's a huge one. Smart meters can tell, or rather utilities can tell through their smart meters what people are doing inside their home and when and how many people are there, and what appliances they're using, even what TV program they're watching. And a lot more details through these smart appliances. So that is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. There was even a court case where a man has been charged with murder based on his smart water meter readings. And for a lot of utilities, the data that's accumulated about an individual can be sold to related entities for marketing purposes, to law enforcement, example. And so this is a new revenue stream, and one of the main reasons why utilities are increasingly adopting smart meters.
Okay, and for those scientific studies that you've got listed on the website, I guess none of them are specifically on smart meters because that sort of a study hasn't been done, but they're on radio frequency radiation, which is the type of EMF emitted from a smart meter.
Most of the studies that we link to are in general about radio frequency. It's, as you say, the type of radiation that's emitted by smart meters, which is also the same type of radiation that's emitted by cell phones and Wi-Fi and cordless phones. But with smart meters, it's typically stronger and pulsed in nature, which tends to be worse for your health. So yeah, this is generally, because smart meters are relatively new in the last decade, there hasn't been a lot of research. We do have a couple of research papers, including one from Australia, they're about smart meters and health impacts specifically, but they tend to be more, looking at aggregating health damage reports, for example, and doing interviews, more qualitative than quantitative studies. But there is more than adequate evidence in order for local governments and national governments to take action. And if those entities refuse to take action to protect the public has a right to defend itself.
Mm, mm. And when you mentioned the pulsed nature of smart meter radiation, because this is sort of a more advanced EMF topic, but within basically what you're referring to, right, is within radio frequency radiation, within that category, there is subcategories. So there's pulsed and non-pulsed. Is that correct? And could you give an example of, a non-pulsed to compare with the pulsed RF radiation that's emitted from the smart meters?
Sure. So, I mean, most modern communications, most 4G cell phone radiation is pulsed. Smart meters are also pulsed. Some of the older wireless, I believe 2G is not pulsed. Some of the analog signals. Um, cell phone cordless phone radiation may not be pulsed, but when you look at it on an EMF meter, if you have a device that measures the strength of this type of radiation, you'll see that the type of radiation emitted by a smart meter is significantly different than, like, for example, your computer emitting Wi-Fi. You have these short, sharp bursts where the microwaves are shot out and intended to be, transmitted up to a mile or two. And so these are strong pulses that, a lot of people react negatively to. And there's been work done on a cellular level about why this is the case. The whole argument by industry and government that, if it doesn't heat you up, if it doesn't cause tissue heating of your skin and your body, it's not going to hurt you. I mean, that's a lie that's been discredited for a long time. And really, what we tell people when they buy an EMF meter from our online store is to go around and disconnect and remove any wireless device, because anything that you want to do in your home with regard to telecommunications or even cooking with a microwave can be done without emitting microwave. So you can use an Ethernet cable in place of Wi-Fi. You can use a toaster oven in place of your microwave. You can use a corded landline in place of your cordless phone or your cell phone. So there are really some low-hanging fruit that people can put into place in their homes immediately to reduce their exposure.
Yeah, okay. So 2G might be an example of a non-pulsed and comparing to the pulsed nature of smart meters.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And so if on the journey to someone getting the smart meter removed, if in just the short term they were to do some sort of shielding work, interim shielding work, is that possible? I've heard of people, I've never had to do this myself, but I've heard of people using aluminum foil, just putting it on the wall, that the inside wall of opposite of where it is.
So, shielding is an option. It's an option of last resort. And you have to be careful when you do it. We recommend that people use an EMF meter to measure before and after levels to make sure that those levels are decreasing. We would recommend avoiding any type of shielding if you're using wireless devices inside the home, because it's just going to reflect that back at you. And, it doesn't address the dirty electricity issue that comes in on the wiring. It doesn't address the fire safety issue, which we haven't really touched on, but that's a major health issue. Smart meters cannot block electrical surges. And so we've seen some examples where large areas of modern California cities have a surge that from, like, for example, a truck hitting a power pole creates an electrical surge. And whereas the older analog meters would act as a capacitor, would block those surges, the smart meter lets them right into the house. And so we've seen in Stockton and in Capitola, smart meters blow off their sockets. Appliances become damaged. We've seen people die in smart meter caused home fires several times. We have seen, smart meters sort of melt and overheat, and the homeowner hears these popping sounds, has to call the fire department. When these incidents happen, typically the utility will arrive before the fire department and remove any evidence that their meter was involved. And so there is a campaign to suppress this information, but there's been a very good report done on the issue by my colleague Nina Beatty, who runs smartmeterharm.org. Smartmeterharm.org is a good fire report on that website. But yeah, in general, if people are faced with a situation where their utility says, you have to have this or we're going to cut your power, there are ways to deal with that. Shielding is a last-ditch option, as I said, to deflect the RF away. And it doesn't address these other risks, but it can reduce the level of radio frequency pollution in the house. That all said, the first step really is to demand the utility in writing, send a certified letter that you refuse the smart meter and you demand that they get it off your premises. So there's the utility company policy, and that's like how whether or not they allow you to opt out or what the terms are and the payment and all that. And then there's the law. And those are two different things that people often confuse. Utility company policy might be that they only provide service with a smart meter and they don't even provide an opt out. But according to the law, if you want a device off of your house or off of your property, they have to comply. Whether or not they were obligated to continue to provide service is something that a regulatory body would decide. But what's important for people to know is that if a utility company personnel is on your property for any other reason besides what's in the utility easement, in other words, they're installing a smart meter against your will, you can tell them to get off of your property, and if they refuse, call the sheriff and report a trespasser, because that's your basic property rights. And we've sort of gotten ourselves into this situation where we've grown dependent on a corrupt system of electricity production and distribution controlled by essentially mobsters who are not putting public health and safety at the forefront. And so in some ways, we've sort of allowed this to happen. We've allowed ourselves to become dependent on the system, and we've not held our government officials to account in terms of effective regulation. And so at the same time as we need to demand and stand up for our rights and really tell the utility how it's going to be in our communities and our homes, we also need to look at longer term at and this is increasingly happening as people get more and more frustrated with the utilities, look at developing microgrids. The utility grid system is really an aging dinosaur that the utility companies are really trying to sort of prop up and make appear to be modern with their smart grid, but it's really lipstick on a pig in this case. And the future is not, with the grid system, which is incredibly inefficient, incredibly harmful to the environment, and really puts corporate profits above, reliable electricity and electricity that's not going to undermine our climate. So people are developing microgrids. They're going off the grid. There's ways to do this, and we need to look into those ways and become more self-sufficient and not be at the mercy so much of these criminal utility companies.
Well, yeah, that was really good. I've got a whole lot of notes and follow-up questions on that. But one of the points that I thought is worth mentioning, or a couple, is with shielding, yeah, like you say, it is totally a last resort, and you really want to get a professional involved. I mean, you can do some stuff on your own, trial and error with an EMF meter, and maybe ask some questions online, but you can actually make the situation worse. As you mentioned, if someone has wireless devices within the home, they're going to be bouncing around. Mm-hmm. And so there's that problem. And then also, the other reason why shielding should just be a last resort is it doesn't solve the environmental pollution for the bees and the birds and the trees, because if you shield the wall, you're just going to bounce all that RF radiation at a higher rate, because it's only going to be going in half the directions it was going previously, all outwards, and all of nature's out there, the insects. And so to just think about saving yourself, quote unquote, that it's not really a a effective long-term strategy for society and for the environment. So I think that's another thing that people should be made aware of. Another thing, a quick question I had is I have actually heard that you shouldn't go near the smart meters, or maybe it's at certain times, because even if you have an EMF meter to go and measure, because just the closeness is not safe if they do a surge. Is that correct?
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to be really careful. And I know from personal experience, shortly after I started Stop Smart Meters, we were contacted by a woman who lives in the East Bay area of California in low-income housing, and she was living above a bank of 80 newly installed PG&E smart meters, and she was wondering if this is harmful to her health. And so we went around, my colleague Amy and I went to Berkeley with some EMF meters from Gigahertz Solutions and Cornet, and did some measurements. And the readings were really off the chart, like what you would expect from being close to a cell tower. So she was basically living above a cell tower, and with the radiation exposure that implies. And when we were busy measuring the smart meters for radiation, and standing about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 feet away from them, I suddenly developed a pounding, heart in my chest, and a feeling of nausea, and a bad headache, sort of in my temples. And I turned to my friend Amy and I said, "We got to get out of here. This is really bad." And then in the subsequent days, I noticed that I was feeling people's cell phones, that the nerves in my head, on my temples, would sort of flare up and be really painful when I was near a smart meter or a cordless phone or a cell phone. And, this was obviously pretty scary at the time. And I sort of thought that maybe it was my own, maybe it was in my head. I'd been working on this issue a lot, and I've been hearing from a lot of people who are damaged, their health, whose health was damaged by these technologies. So I thought, oh, maybe it's just me. And a couple of things happened that made me really realize that it wasn't. It is something that was happening physiologically. And one of those instances was I was in a grocery store, and someone was on their cell phone right around the corner, and I didn't see them, but I felt it before I saw them. And similar thing happened on the train when I was asleep, and I suddenly got that pain in my temples, and I opened my eyes and looked out, and there was a cell tower right there that we were going by on the train. So those things happened, and it's something. Electromagnetic sensitivity is something that people can be inherent in them, but a lot more frequently they have a high exposure that then injures them and sensitizes them to exposures that were previously not a problem for them. And Daphne Takover, who's an attorney, an Israeli attorney, is one of those people. She started We Are the Evidence. She and Robert F. Kennedy's group are suing the FCC over their radiation guidelines. And Daphne was injured by her MacBook, by the radiation from that. And she used to use cell phones. She used to use Wi-Fi. She'd be an attorney into the city all the time. And then overnight, she became an EMF refugee and had to move into the countryside. And, with all that implies about, the effects on career, the effects on having limited telecommunications access, and so EMF sensitivity can happen to anyone because of an acute exposure. And because of that, we need to make it safe for the whole population and not have these exposures at all.
Yeah, totally agree. It's definitely can really change some people's lives, and it's sort of interesting how you've had those sixth sense type experiences. Another thing I wanted to get into was you mentioned just quickly fires, for the fire risk aspect of all this. I hadn't heard much about that. Is that something that's been documented, in quite a few places around the US and overseas, or?
Around the world, there have been multiple recalls of smart meters that have been deployed and later found to be the cause of fires. It's a recurring issue, unfortunately. People have lost their homes, they've lost their lives, and there's a very good report on smartmeterharm.org that you can download and give to your fire department, give to your local council. The utilities say, oh, it's internal wiring, or it's anything but their own meter, and there has been some collusion between some. Or at least possible collusion between fire departments and utilities who are trying to, obviously cover this up and avoid regulators cracking down. But, there have been hundreds of cases of fires and electrical faults that are, that cause a hazard. Some of them are related to inadequate, incorrect installations where, the smart meter isn't secure in the socket and it creates an arc type fire. Some are issues with incompatibility between older wiring and the newer, computer digital components of the smart meter. So people need to take this very seriously, and that's a separate issue from the health and the privacy, but it's an issue that would justify, refusal of this technology in someone's home or community, for sure.
Yeah, and the other thing from your big long sentences and stuff before that I was interested in was the microgrids you mentioned. So, because I think in the short term, one of the ways we can kind of show other people in society that you can still have a normal life and manage your exposure and significantly mitigate, like especially the RF, by organizing homes in a certain way and a community in a certain way. I think that creating microgrids, like you mentioned, would be one great way. And I'd like to do something like that in New Zealand with other people, like some sort of eco village. But how were those microgrids that you mentioned working? Like, what sort of power were they creating?
So, battery technology is improving, and you got to be selective because there's some, renewable technologies that are high EMF and put out high levels of dirty electricity. So choosing like an inverter, for example, to go with your solar panels that doesn't put out high levels of dirty electricity is really important. But for example, either as a one household or a group of households could, invest together in a solar energy system that could either use batteries or, some of them will pump water uphill and then at night run it down through turbines that will produce energy. So there's different ways of storing and being able to use energy. But the prices are coming down on these technologies, and there's some interesting experiments that are happening around this. In addition, communities with the existing grid tie that they have now can choose to become smart meter free zones, either the whole town or even just a couple houses or a particular neighborhood. Having a smart meter or wireless free zone can provide a safe refuge for people who are very sensitive to these waves, and also create a much healthier environment for people who aren't necessarily sensitive, but who are concerned about exposures. So, that's something that that's the first step in terms of organizing, is going to your neighbors. We encourage people to get some public health warning cards, which relate to wireless exposure from our website. We also have brochures and EMF meters available, and just going door to door, talking to your neighbors, and getting them to be more familiar with the issue, and eventually, hopefully agreeing to become a smart meter free zone is a really good thing that people can do that's manageable.
Yeah. And on that topic of EMF meters, so I bought my EMF meter from your website, stopsmartmeters.org, and I've got the page up here. I think we should maybe just go through just some of the basics of EMF meters for the audience, because I think that one of the really crucial things in the very short term is that more people have an EMF meter. And you don't need, everyone in a family doesn't need one, but one household should probably have one, or if you can share one with a few households, that would also work fine. Because otherwise it's so difficult to explain this invisible energy, right? And so having EMF meters makes it all a lot more convincing for someone who's a total newbie to this.
Yeah, I mean, something, most people can't feel it. You can't see or hear it. And so it can be a little bit abstract when you talk about these issues. When you have an EMF meter that directly responds to the presence of wireless technologies and shows you the pattern of exposure and how high those exposures are in terms of like milliwatts per square meter, that really can, it can give you your ears and your eyes with regard to the EMF world. You can understand the way that it behaves in a way that you simply cannot without the use of a meter. And it's also a great public relations tool. The Cornet ED88T Plus is sort of the basic meter that is the most popular basic meter that people get. It includes like radio frequency as well as low frequency measuring ability. And it has a screen that you can see the EMF levels over time. And so we recommend that people use these as a tool in their homes and in their communities to sort of mark out where the levels are highest and to be a sort of a detective, an EMF detective, in terms of using the sound feature, in terms of using the multicolored, the green, yellow, and red LED lights that are the ones from our store are calibrated to precautionary building biology levels. And so basically do this work in your house and around your neighborhood to assess levels and then begin to develop a strategy to bring those levels down and still get the connectivity and the convenience that you need.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the first one that's on your website, the Cornet ED88T Plus. That's the one I have. And you said the word low frequency, but I think just for beginners. So low frequency is the electric fields and magnetic fields, and high frequency is the radio frequency radiation.
Right.
So that meter does all three of the main kinds. The only thing it doesn't do is dirty electricity, and you're never going to get a meter, or from my knowledge, you're never going to get a meter that does all four, I don't think.
Yeah,
right?
probably not one single meter. We do have the Alpha Lab power line meter. That's a plug-in meter that does measure dirty electricity levels. So that's people often buy the Cornet with the Alpha Lab power line meter. And we have a good combo discount deal for this. And I should say all of the proceeds from the store go directly to Stop Smart Meters to maintain our website, to maintain our hotline, and to do the outreach and consultations that we do around the world. They're really a critical tool. We have some refurbished ones for $139 US, some of the older style. But it's if you're concerned about it, or you think that you might have high exposures, or you really want to learn more about it and reach out to others in your community, an EMF meter is really a critical tool. People who use their cell phones a lot, when you show them that it goes up to the red level, the extreme concern level, a lot of the time they do a double take and think, oh God, what am I doing, in terms of exposure to myself, at a time when brain tumor rates are rising and the science is becoming ever more, firm on, the fact that the exposures, particularly close exposures and long-term exposures, are related significantly to cancer.
Yeah, and you mentioned with the Cornet, it's got the colored LEDs, which I think is so intuitive and easy to use, and makes it really useful first EMF meter if you're only going to get one, because it's just very intuitive that, okay, green is safe, yellow is concerning, more yellow is very concerning, and red is off the charts extreme concern. And so that's why I think that's the meter that I recommend to people, because of simply that feature. And also it's got lots of other great features that you can either ignore or use. So it fits someone who's wanting to go the full Monty and do a lot of things on the meter. But it also, if you're like an elderly person or someone who's not tech savvy and you just want it to do some basic things, it does that perfectly as well.
It's a good balanced meter for people who are just starting out, even people who might want to get more advanced meters in the future, just to have that kind of pocket meter with you. It's very convenient. We don't tell people that the green is totally safe. Really, the only level,
true, yeah.
But it's safer. The only real safe level of artificial EMFs is 0, and of course, the reality is that most of us live in environments where there is at least a little bit of radio frequency pollution, and it's important to try and minimize that to the extent possible. But we're moving toward a vision where we have a telecommunication system that is primarily wired, where high quality landlines are maintained and improved, where people have fiber optic or DSL connections, and where wireless is really limited to emergency usage at most. And when you're in your house, or when you're at a cafe, or when you're you don't really need wireless connectivity. What you need is what people demand and what people want is the connection to the internet, which can be provided through a wire. So with analog meters, it's smart to have someone from the utility come and make sure that everything is okay once a month. It's smart to have that regular presence out in the field, and there are consequences to not having that. Whereas the utility industry and telecom industry are pushing 5G and are pushing, smart grid technologies as being the future, we really, based on the evidence, are seeing these developments as a red herring, as a diversion from quote unquote progress, as something that's putting us at greater risk through a number of unknown variables.
Yeah. And another thing, you just mentioned 5G, with which is a whole nother rabbit hole. Might get you on for another episode on that. But the Cornet ED88T Plus, it goes for radio frequency radiation, which is the overall category that 5G is in. Although the future forms of 5G are probably a little bit more complicated. But it says it does 100 megahertz to 8 gigahertz, and some of the early stages of 5G, at least from what I understand in Australia and New Zealand, are within that, aren't they? Because isn't 5G technically just 3 gigahertz, but then the upper could be up to 100 gigahertz, and obviously once you exceed 8, this meter's not going to be able to measure it. But
and what's
the early stages
well, what's important to emphasize is that 5G is really just a marketing term. It doesn't reference a specific set of frequencies, although the utilities are proposing that millimeter wave, higher gigahertz levels are going to be used. But primarily those are still in the experimental phase. About 95% of wireless cell tower radiation is still within the 4G frequencies, which could be measured easily by the Cornet. It's only these millimeter wave frequencies where there hasn't really been consumer level meters developed to measure it yet, where they're wanting to go in that direction. And there's certain health impacts that are particularly alarming with regard to 5G. Mainly that the radiation tends to accumulate on the skin, tends to not penetrate objects like the older style 4G radiation would. And so there's particular concern about skin cancer, and there's some new information that's come to light about how various frequencies impact insects like bees and how the radiation is absorbed by their bodies. And so we're really they're just rolling this out without any kind of medical or environmental testing. People need to be aware that these industries are completely reckless and don't think twice about harming human health and ending lives if a profit is possible.
Yeah, and I just thought another thing to mention that beginners might wonder is, a meter like the Cornet ED88T Plus, it's still going to be useful for ages, even if 5G or when 5G, as they move into that, because there's still going to be plenty of 4G radiation. There's still going to be your Wi-Fi router. There's still going to be cell phones. Still going to be Bluetooth. So the meter is very, very broad spectrum in its usage, and it will stay that way forever, pretty much, just because a new 5G and the extreme end of 5G, the millimeter wavelengths, won't be able to be measured on this EMF meter. Everything else will still be able to be.
So, the difference between 4G and 5G is substantially different than the difference between 3G and 4G. With the transition from, and the previous generations, and when we're talking about G, this all references, the first generation, second generation, and so on. of wireless technology. You first had the ability to just talk on a phone, and then they brought in, the ability to text, and then with 3G to do limited online stuff, and then 4G you could do everything. 5G is promising, fast like downloads of a movie in 5 seconds and so forth. And with 5G, the telecom companies would like to put in new small cells on top of the pre-existing layer of macro cell towers. So you're not going to be replacing the 4G. The 5G is just going to be added on top of the pre-existing levels, on the pre-existing frequencies. So, we expect those frequencies to be in use, unfortunately for some time before.
Yeah, it's definitely a extreme situation. The next meter that you have on here is a little bit cheaper, more affordable, I should say, which is the Trifield TF2. And I often read a lot of blogs and see YouTube videos on the, what to do when you're buying an EMF meter. And pretty much 9 times out of 10, people recommend Cornet ED88T Plus and Trifield TF2 as your like basic two that are good enough to get the job done, but not going to break the bank. What do you see as the key differences if someone chooses the TF2?
Yeah, those are the two sort of basic meters that we have on our website. These are the meters that we use personally, and so we've field tested them. If you try to spend less than about $160 for a new meter, you're going to get something that is not of high quality and will not necessarily give you readings that are useful in terms of making decisions. So these are the sort of most affordable meters that we found, the Cornet and the Trifield, that are still high quality enough to really give you a good idea of what you're dealing with in terms of EMF pollution, or what they call electrosmog pollution. So the TF2 is a simpler meter than the Cornet. It measures pretty much the same frequency ranges. It doesn't have as many features. It does have sound and light and a backlight. But if you're someone that's really into a lot of features and you want to, explore all the different modes, then the Cornet is probably for you. If you kind of want a simple meter and you don't mind, referencing a chart to look at what the numbers mean, because with the Cornet you have the green, yellow, and red lights that are easy to look at and at a glance be able to tell, this is a level that's not good, or this is a level that is more or less, safer. With the TF2, you have to sort of do a little bit more work in terms of looking at the chart and looking at the ranges, becoming familiar with the ranges that are suggested by the Building Biology Institute. So, typically we recommend if someone is maybe an older person with vision issues, that the larger screen on the TF2 is probably a better choice. And if you want something that's going to be measuring magnetic fields more precisely, the TF2 is better than the Cornet in that respect. The Cornet is primarily a radio frequency meter with the addition of these, these low frequency antennas, whereas the TF2 is more of an all around meter. It has, good quality antennas for all three of the types of EMF. So for most people, we recommend the Cornet. There are some people who want a simpler, more robust meter, perhaps, and that's not quite as complicated. And for those people, the TF2 seems to be a better choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'd definitely like to get see someone else's TF2 and just have a play with one. But and then the next one you've got on here is the EM Fields Acoustometer AM10, and so this is a RF meter specifically. So it's specifically for radio frequency radiation only, and obviously because it's a sole one type meter, it's more precise than the all rounders that we've just listed, isn't it?
So yeah, the Acoustimeter AM10 from EM Fields is a great meter. It measures radio frequency microwave radiation only, and it's a higher end meter. It's a more precise meter in terms of measuring RF than you're going to get with the multimeters that we discussed previously. So this is a meter that we recommend to people who are, for example, either want a higher end instrument to measure radio frequency, and it has a louder speaker, and it has both a peak and an average LED scale on it, which is helpful. But for people who are electromagnetically sensitive and perhaps who are looking for housing, and they want a meter that's precise down to very low levels to be able to detect, close levels close to or at zero, the EM Fields Acoustimeter AM10 is a good choice. We have it on our website now, I think for $329.95 US. And EM Fields is a very good company. They are perhaps of all the manufacturers of EMF meters, the folks who are most familiar with the health and environmental consequences of microwave exposure. And so this is a company that is a precaution, coming from a precautionary level and a precautionary perspective. They set their LED levels at levels which are precautionary. So that's a good advantage of the Acoustimeter. And also, if you're working to educate larger groups or going door to door or talking to people, the higher volume of the Acoustimeter can be really useful, because when you're by a cell tower, you'll hear this high-pitched screech, whereas Wi-Fi is more of a tat, 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 and you'll begin to be able to differentiate different sources of EMF from one another, and that gives you more information about, what kind of source is responsible for the recorded levels and what you might be able to do about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that one, so it's going to be more, it's going to do a better job at RF than the Cornet or the TF2, because it's specifically for RF.
Yeah, so basically you have one level of meters that are, in the sort of upper hundreds of US dollars generally, and those are multimeters. They measure, typically magnetic and electric fields, which are low frequency fields, and radio frequency fields. And then as you get, into the higher end meters, typically the meters will measure one type of EMF and do it really well. So typically people will have 1 meter for dirty electricity, 1 meter for low frequency, and 1 meter for radio frequency if they get really, into this and want more precise equipment. But for most people, trying to figure out, what is emitting radio frequency in my house? What is there a smart meter? Is the analog meter that the utility gave me an actual analog, or is it a Trojan horse analog, which look like an analog but actually have electronic components? And we've seen people develop health issues from those specifically, and it's just blindingly dishonest for the utility company to be getting people to pay for something that they're trying to avoid. But that's another story.
Yeah. And then there's 2 more you've got listed here. Alpha Lab low frequency gas meter that's currently out of stock. So that's what's that one for? Mainly magnetic and electric field?
Yes, yeah, that measures low frequency fields. That's a higher end meter, the UHS2. We are out of stock, hoping to get those in probably next month in February 2020. And it's a good low frequency a meter. And Alpha Lab is a good company. They also make the power line meter, the dirty electricity meter, which is a plug-in meter.
That's the next one.
Yeah, that doesn't require batteries. So you just plug it in your wall and you get a noise, sound coming from it, and you also get a number in millivolts. And that you can take that number and look at a chart and basically decide, okay, my house has manageable levels of dirty electricity, or hey, it's way off the charts, and either it's caused by a smart meter or maybe some other equipment that you might have. But it gives you, each meter gives you more information about the levels in your environment. And, if you do purchase the meter from the stopsmartmeters.org store, we provide support and technical backup. So if you're having questions about the meter, or even like what to do with the information that you've generated from the meters, and in other words, how to reduce your exposure, we're here and we can provide phone or email support with every purchase.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just thought I'd mention at this point that if anyone's listening and you're interested in getting these, the discount code Grow Sanctuary gets you, I think, 5% off any of the things on stopsmartmeters.org store. And they also sell, you have combinations where you can get a further discounts if you buy 2 EMF meters together. And also you have resources to help educate people, like brochures, DVDs, books, stickers, quite a lot of things on this page. And like you mentioned early on, all the proceeds, all the money made goes to helping maintain stopsmartmeters.org. And that's another reason why I decide to kind of work with you guys and recommend people go here, because you're actually supporting an organization that's been on this mission to create a really healthy world for a long time. You're veterans, you could say, in this area. So
yeah, we celebrate our 10th anniversary actually this year. We've been around 10 years, and we are continuing to do the same things that we have from the very beginning: organize and fight against these technologies and raise awareness. And we certainly appreciate people's people going to us, to our store, rather than Amazon. As Amazon and companies like Facebook are actively investing in drone technology and wireless technology, and they're making the problem worse. Whereas we're organizing to defend communities and really reduce the level of electrosmog. So if the the consequence of your purchase in terms of generating or preventing electrosmog is a factor in your decision, then we hope that you'll choose us, and also consider a donation to help us continue our work around this issue.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the smaller companies generally have higher integrity, and you want to vote with your dollar and support the people that have the same values as you. And so that's exactly the point you just made, that if you're purchasing through Amazon, you're sort of we want to try and avoid doing things like that where possible.
I actually deleted my Amazon account late last year, and it was very satisfying. It wasn't easy though. They don't make it easy. In fact, on the Amazon website, I was like, "How do you you search? How do you delete your account?" And it comes out with this this audiobook for, I think it was like $9.99 on how to delete your Amazon account. So you have to get this audiobook and listen to it and like go through all these procedures. And it ends up being, you have to get into a chat with Amazon, to an actual chat with a person, presumably, or AI or whatever, and say, I really want to delete my account. And then they send you a link, and then you have to click on that. And it's like kind of a convoluted process. They don't make it easy. But, people really should delete their Facebook accounts, delete their Amazon accounts, not be supporting, Verizon, so these cellular companies, because all these dollars are going to make it worse in many places. Like, for example, where we live in in Plumas County in California, in the northern Sierra Nevada, cell companies are coming in a big way. They've finished saturating the urban and suburban areas, and now they're moving on to the rural areas. And so these antennas and these new towers are being funded by people's cellular contracts. So we urge people to really look at what these companies are doing, and find other ways of purchasing and networking online, rather than Facebook, which is allowing false political ads and saturating communities with wireless technology, and Amazon, which is just scooping up all of these stores and really trying to be the one place where people buy stuff. So it's very satisfying to take these actions and to not be personally supportive of these companies. Google, for example, who are taking millions and putting it into bad stuff.
Yeah, I've heard you can use. I sometimes use the DuckDuckGo, and there's other search engines like that. There's one
Startpage,
for
I think.
Yeah, there's one that I think the more you search on it, it plants trees, like Ecosia or something like that.
I use Start
But yeah,
Page. It's a little bit slower than Google, but it's the same results. Essentially, startpage.com.
okay.
Yeah.
Startpage.com. Sweet. Well, this has been a really informative episode, Josh. I'm really thankful that you've come on, and really thankful for all the work that you've been doing behind the scenes before most of us even knew what was going on. Uh, there's always got to be like someone getting out there at the start, and it's very easy for other people to. It makes it easier for other people to join in and become active, but it's difficult for the people who start these things off. So you've done a good job getting onto this early, and people should definitely check out your website that has so much information. It has a group directory, so you can see if there's someone or a group that's already in your country or region or state that so you can link up with other people who share your values. What else? There's so much on here. Definitely check out the website.
There's an FAQ section that we have, frequently asked questions. It goes into detail about how to refuse smart meters or how to demand removal. We have that global directory you mentioned. If people can't find a local group near where they are, I urge you to contact us and contact the one that's nearby and start your own, and be a nucleus for a group starting in your area. We also do public speaking engagements, and we provide free advice to the public on organizing their communities. And then we do some private consulting for people who want to reduce the EMF in their homes, for example.
Sweet. And so, is there anywhere else people can find you if they wanted to support your work or get in touch other than the website, stopsmartmeters.org?
StopSmartMeters.org is our website, and they can email me personally if they have a question or want to get involved. I'm at josh@stopsmartmeters.org. That's StopSmartMeters, plural.org. And we also have a Twitter feed, which is StopSmeters. The Stop Smart Meters one was already taken, so we're Stop Meters. And that's we're not on Facebook because we don't like them, and we're not on Amazon. But people can call our toll-free hotline. At least it's toll-free in the U.S. So yeah, we're not on Facebook or Google or Amazon for obvious reasons. But people can contact us via our toll-free hotline, which is 888-965-6435. That's toll-free in the United States. And people can call, without it being toll-free, paying toll charges out of the U.S. But yeah, email, phone, we have a website. We encourage people to get involved, contact us, let us know how we can support your local efforts. That's why we're here, literally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on today, and yeah, we may, if anyone has any questions, maybe comment them in the YouTube comment section, or if you're listening to this on another podcast provider, then send me an email with your questions, and we can probably do a follow up at some point in the future, because there's definitely more topics that you could talk about, and probably more in depth stuff we could go into for smart meters.
That sounds great. Yeah, and I really appreciate you having me on today and taking a closer look at these issues. A lot of people, sort of assume that it's some sort of conspiracy theory, but there are some very real issues at stake here. That if you ignore the mainstream media and look at the sources and the real facts, people come to other conclusions that is propagated by the corporate world.
Right. Yeah. Totally. So, all right. Thanks, Josh. Well, there you go. That was Josh Hart of StopSmartMeters.org. I really, really enjoyed speaking with him. You can tell he's really passionate about what he's trying to achieve and the work he's doing. Definitely check out StopSmartMeters.org. I'm sure you could learn something from the website, even if you're someone who's experienced with this whole EMF problem. And if you're a beginner, it's a great place to get started. You can contact them if you've got questions. You can also use parts of the website to find local groups to work with, because a lot of these issues are nuanced depending on which part of the world you're in. there's general information and then there's local information in some situations. So definitely good to connect with your local EMF groups or your local 5G groups or your local Stop Smart Meters groups. If you're interested in the sort of work that I'm putting out, the content I'm putting out, you can check out Instagram at Grow Sanctuary, YouTube and BitChute Grow Sanctuary for videos. I post a lot of interesting health tip type videos there. These podcasts are available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And I've also got a website, growsanctuary.com, which has a resource list, which includes products I recommend, organizations that I recommend, things like that. And if you want to help me reach more people, then please share this podcast or one of the other ones or one of my other videos with your friends, family, with anyone. I really want to help get this important information to as many people as possible. So please share my stuff around. And obviously, another great way you could help me out and also help yourself out, get an EMF meter. And if you're going to get one, stopsmartmeters.org sells them at the lowest price I've seen. And it's a great way to support, an organization that's doing a lot of good work for free. I mean, they put out all that information and they're not getting paid to do it. And so it's good to support those sorts of organizations. And if you use my discount code, Grow Sanctuary, I think you get 5% off, which makes a good difference when you're buying an EMF meter. My preferred one, like I said in the podcast, is the Cornet ED88T Plus. I've been using that for over a year now. Still like it. I've lent it to people, helped out a lot of people, showed it to people. We need more people with EMF meters walking around measuring things. I think that's everything I need to cover. Yep. All right. I hope you all have a great week and be aware of your electromagnetic environment and look after yourself.